Honestly, Ashton, I don't understand why Harrison hired you in the first place, Gwen Hollister said without even looking up from her computer screen, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as if she were playing the piano. All this talk about relationships with suppliers. We're a company, not an NGO for sentimental immigrant stories. I stood there in her office on the 42nd floor, watching her cancel 18 months of my life with 3 quick clicks of the mouse. I felt something break inside me that I hadn't felt since I was 17. The same empty pain that came the morning I found my father slumped over the kitchen table, surrounded by rejection letters and foreclosure notices, his heart having given up on the stress of losing everything to corporate predators just like her. Akiko Tanaka in Osaka. The Petrova family in Bulgaria. Miguel Santos in Mexico City. People who trusted me, who built their businesses around our partnerships, who were probably at this very moment preparing shipments for which they would never be paid. Honestly, Gwen continued, now with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, all these international contracts are just too complicated. Too much special care needed, too many cultural sensitivities to manage. We need suppliers who understand American business practices. My name is Ashton, and I need you to understand something about Gwen Hollister before we go any further. She wasn't just any executive. She was the kind of person who built her entire career on a foundation of other people's shattered dreams. 23 years at Morrison Industrial, rising from junior analyst to vice president of global acquisitions, leaving a trail of destroyed careers behind her like breadcrumbs. But here's what she didn't know about me, what no one at Morrison knew about me. 15 years ago, when I was a freshman at State University, my father worked for a small consulting firm that Gwen's previous company acquired. Dad was 58, had been with his company for 16 years, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had built relationships across Europe that brought in 60% of their international revenue. Gwen systematically destroyed him over the course of 6 months. Not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the slow poison of professional humiliation. She questioned his reports in meetings, reassigned his clients to younger employees, started rumors about his mental capacity, made him rewrite proposals 5, 6, 7 times for reasons that changed daily. She turned his own team against him, suggesting that he was holding back the company's growth. My father, who survived by immigrating to this country with nothing, who built a reputation based on honor and reliability, who never missed a day of work in his entire career, began having panic attacks in the office parking lot. He would sit in his car for 20 minutes every morning trying to gather the strength to go in and face another day of psychological warfare. What about the penalty clauses? I asked quietly, the coordinated withdrawal provisions in those contracts? Gwen waved her hand dismissively. Legal will take care of any paperwork that needs to be filled out. These people should be grateful they got 18 months of business from us. Most international suppliers never get opportunities like this. She finished canceling the last contract and turned to face me with that triumphant smile. Honestly, Ashton, I think this will be good for your professional development. You've become too emotionally involved with these partnerships. In this business, you can't afford to care about every supplier's personal history. Success requires a focus on results, not relationships. And then she said the 7 words that changed everything: we don't need your foreign connections anymore. I nodded slowly, thanked her for the feedback, and left her office. But instead of going back to my desk, I walked straight to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and started making phone calls. If you're enjoying this story of justice and reversal, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next proved that some people completely underestimate the power of patience, planning, and the relationships we build with each other. Because while Gwen was probably celebrating her big strategic reorganization, thinking she had solved the problem of difficult suppliers, I was quietly activating a system that took 18 months to build. A system she never saw coming. The first call went to Akiko Tanaka in Osaka. It was 3 in the morning her time, but she answered on the second ring, probably thinking it was an emergency. Which, in a way, it was. Akiko, this is Ashton from Morrison. I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and then I need you to make some calls. But before I explain what happened in the next 6 hours, you need to understand who Gwen Hollister really was and why I spent 15 years of my life preparing for this moment. Gwen wasn't just another ruthless executive. She was an expert at systematically destroying lives with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of a corporate psychopath. 23 years climbing the corporate ladder, leaving a trail of ruined careers, broken families, and shattered dreams. 15 years ago, When my father David worked at Blackstone Consulting, Gwen arrived there as part of an acquisition. Dad was the kind of man you wanted as a father, honest, hardworking, respected by colleagues from 12 different countries. He spoke fluent German, French, and Spanish, and had built relationships in Europe that generated 60% of the company's international revenue. Gwen immediately identified him as a threat. Not because he competed with her for positions, but because he represented everything she hated: competence based on real merit, genuine respect from colleagues, and most of all, success that didn't depend on internal political maneuvering. Her campaign against my father was a masterpiece of psychological destruction. It started subtly, questioning his reports in public meetings. "David, I'm sure your analysis of the German market is correct, but have you considered more contemporary factors?" Always with that smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then came the reassignments. Clients my father had cultivated for years suddenly needed a more agile approach. Translation: younger employees that Gwen could control. Important projects began to be passed on to other departments. Crucial meetings were scheduled at times that conflicted with appointments she had made for him. But the masterstroke was how she turned his team against him. She started whispering concerns about my father's adaptability to the new working methods. She questioned whether anyone from the previous generation could keep up with the pace required. She suggested that he was resisting change and delaying critical projects. Within 6 months, my father went from respected leader to corporate pariah. He came home every night visibly exhausted, not physically, but emotionally drained. He began obsessively reviewing his work, redoing reports 5, 6, 7 times because Gwen always found clarity issues or strategic focus issues that changed with each version. "Maybe she's right," he told me one night during my freshman year of college. "Maybe I really am falling behind. The business world is changing so fast." I was 19 and didn't fully understand what was happening, but I could see my father, the most competent man I knew, doubting himself for the first time in his life. The panic attacks started in the 5th month. He would sit in his car in the company parking lot for 20 minutes every morning, trying to muster the courage to walk into the building and face another day of systematic humiliation. My mother found the anxiety medication hidden in his dresser drawer. Dad had never taken a pill in his life, not even aspirin, but now he needed medication to function at work. In the 6th month, Gwen delivered the final blow. She called a meeting with the entire international team to re-evaluate partnership strategies. She prepared a detailed presentation showing how traditional methods were costing the company money. Each slide was a veiled criticism of my father's work, without mentioning him directly. "We need more dynamic approaches to the global market," she told a room full of colleagues who had respected my father for years. "Relationships based on nostalgia and old-fashioned methods simply don't deliver the results our investors expect." The dismissal came the following week. Organizational restructuring, they called it. Nothing personal, just business. My father spent the next 8 months trying to find another job. But Gwen had been careful. Professional references were adequate, but unenthusiastic. Industry contacts had been fed subtle hints about adaptability issues and resistance to change. On the morning I found my father slumped over the kitchen table, surrounded by rejection letters and foreclosure notices. His heart had simply given out. The stress, the humiliation, the sense of having failed his family after a lifetime of hard work, it was too much. The death certificate said heart attack. I knew the real cause had a first and last name, Gwen Hollister. It was at that funeral, watching my mother cry over the coffin of the man she loved, that I made the decision that would guide the next 15 years of my life. It wasn't enough to hate her. It wasn't enough to want revenge. I needed to become someone who could understand how people like Gwen operated, how they thought, how they justified destroying human lives in the name of profit and personal ambition. I studied business administration, specialized in international supply chain management, and spent 7 years working for smaller companies, learning every aspect of global procurement. Not because I loved the work, but because I was building myself into exactly the kind of person who could get close to someone like Gwen. When the position at Morrison opened up and I saw Gwen's name listed as the hiring manager, I knew the universe was giving me an opportunity one couldn't pass up. But I also knew that simple revenge wouldn't be enough. It had to be poetic. It had to teach her something about consequences. It had to make her feel the same helplessness my father felt in those last months. For 18 months, I built relationships that Morrison never dreamed possible. Not just with suppliers, but with their families, their communities, their stories. I learned that Akiko Tanaka's grandfather had been forced to sell his textile business after the war, and she was trying to rebuild what her family had lost. I discovered that the Petrova family had started their packaging company after fleeing political persecution, using their grandmother's life savings as collateral. Miguel Santos had 3 daughters, all studying engineering, all hoping to expand the family's precision tool business into aerospace components. Every relationship I cultivated was with people who reminded me of my father. People who had worked their entire lives to build something meaningful, something that could outlive them. But I wasn't building these relationships for the benefit of Morrison. I was building for something much bigger. Because while I was traveling, negotiating, and solving supply chain problems, I was also researching Gwen's career history. Every company she had worked for, every acquisition she had managed, every restructuring she had overseen. And what I discovered was a pattern that made my stomach churn with recognition. 15 years ago, it wasn't just my father. There was Linda Chun, a translator who had helped Gwen's team navigate contracts in Taiwan. Gwen fired her 3 days before Christmas, citing budget cuts, then hired her replacement at twice the salary. Linda's family lost their home. There was Roberto Vega, who had managed relationships with Mexican manufacturers for 8 years. Gwen eliminated his position, took credit for his work, then used his contacts to negotiate deals that saved the company millions. Roberto ended up driving for a delivery service, trying to pay for his wife's cancer treatments without health insurance. The pattern was always the same: identify vulnerable people doing essential work, systematically undermine them, take everything they've built, and move on without looking back. Gwen had built her entire career on the corpses of small business owners and immigrant workers who trusted the wrong person. And now, as I watched her cancel contracts representing $47 million in annual revenue, calling our international partners unnecessary foreign connections, I knew that the moment I had prepared for 15 years to live had finally arrived. Because every supplier whose contract she had just canceled wasn't just a business partner. They were people who had been broken by corporate predators just like her, who had rebuilt themselves from nothing, who understood what it meant to have your life's work destroyed by someone who saw you as disposable. And slowly, carefully, over the last 18 months, I had begun to tell them stories. Not about my father specifically, but about the patterns I had observed, the warning signs to watch out for, the importance of protecting yourself when dealing with corporate predators who might not honor their commitments. By the 12th month, every vendor contract I had negotiated included specific clauses about notice periods, penalty structures, and coordinated withdrawal rights. Terms that seemed reasonable from Morrison's perspective, but would prove devastating if triggered simultaneously. Now, as I made that first call to Akiko in Osaka, the system I had spent 18 months building was about to be activated. And Gwen, who was probably celebrating her big strategic reorganization, had no idea that she had just set in motion a sequence of events that would change everything. What she didn't know was that every international supplier she had so casually dismissed was connected in a network I had carefully woven. A network based on shared experiences, mutual protection, and an understanding of exactly when to act together. Within 6 hours, every supplier I had built partnerships with over 18 months had received identical messages. Not from me directly, but from each other. The network I had spent so much time building wasn't just about business relationships, it was about shared experiences, mutual protection, and understanding exactly when to act together. Akiko called the Petrova family in Bulgaria. The Petrovas contacted Miguel in Mexico City. Miguel contacted the semiconductor manufacturers in Taiwan. The Taiwanese suppliers called the packaging companies in Vietnam. Like dominoes falling in reverse, each conversation triggered 3 more, until suppliers in 12 countries were simultaneously reviewing their contracts with Morrison and discovering something interesting. Each of the agreements contained the same coordinated withdrawal clause that I had carefully negotiated months earlier. Language that looked like standard legal protection, but actually meant that if Morrison terminated any international supplier without cause, all remaining international suppliers had the right to withdraw immediately without penalty. On Thursday morning, the Morrison production floor was silent. Not because of a strike or equipment failure, but because 68% of its critical components simply stopped arriving. The precision tools from Miguel that kept our aerospace division running. The specialty polymers from Vietnam that made our automotive parts possible. The textile components from Akiko that were essential to our defense contracts. I watched from my desk as operations managers began to panic around 10 in the morning, making frantic calls to suppliers who politely explained that they were exercising their contractual rights to pull out. By noon, manufacturing supervisors were huddled in emergency meetings trying to understand how Morrison had become so dependent on international suppliers we apparently no longer needed. Gwen spent Thursday afternoon in crisis management mode, calling domestic suppliers who quoted prices 3 times higher than our international partners, with delivery schedules extending into the next quarter. Companies that might be able to supply substitutes for some components, but had never even heard of others. This is a period of temporary adjustment, she announced to the operations team on Friday morning, her voice carrying just a hint of tension. We are transitioning to more reliable domestic partners that align with our strategic vision. But on Friday afternoon, Morrison's largest customer, a defense contractor expecting delivery of specialized components next week, called to express concerns about production delays. Then the automotive company that depended on Morrison's precision parts began asking questions about alternative suppliers. I spent that entire week documenting everything. Not just the operational chaos, but Gwen's responses to it. Her dismissive comments about suppliers who were overreacting to normal business decisions. Her insistence that international partners were inherently unreliable and that Morrison was better off without them. Her complete inability to understand why ending 68% of her supply chain simultaneously could cause problems. But the real revelation came on Monday morning when CEO Harrison called an emergency executive meeting. I wasn't supposed to be in that room, but Harrison had specifically requested that I attend, as I was the only person who fully understood Morrison's international supplier relationships. Gwen seemed genuinely confused as to why I was there, probably assuming I would be blamed for the crisis rather than consulted about solutions. Harrison began the meeting with a simple question. Can anyone explain to me how we went from record profits to production shutdown in 4 days? Gwen launched into a polished presentation on supply chain diversification, strategic realignment, and the benefits of domestic sourcing. She had prepared slides showing cost projections and risk assessments, all demonstrating why eliminating international suppliers was sound business strategy. The temporary disruption we are experiencing, she concluded confidently, is the natural consequence of transitioning away from an over-reliance on foreign partnerships that were ultimately unsustainable. Harrison listened patiently, then turned to me. Ashton, you built these relationships. Help me understand what really happened here. This was the moment I had been preparing for without fully realizing it 18 months ago. I opened my laptop and pulled up the presentation I had been building since Tuesday. The one that told the real story of Morrison's international partnerships. Mr. Harrison, with your permission, I'd like to show you exactly who our international suppliers are and what our relationships with them really meant. The first slide showed Akiko Tanaka's textile facility in Osaka. Not just production statistics, but photos of her family's workshop, her grandfather's original equipment, the 3 generations of workers who had helped build components for Morrison's defense contracts. I explained how Akiko had restructured her entire operation around Morrison specifications, hiring 12 additional workers and investing in new machinery specifically for our partnership. The second slide introduced the Petrova family. Elena Petrova's husband had lost his engineering job during Bulgaria's economic crisis, and their packaging company had been the family's path back to stability. The Morrison contracts had allowed them to expand into a new facility, providing jobs for 43 people in their rural community. The third slide showed Miguel Santos and his precision tooling operation. I displayed photos of his 3 daughters, all studying engineering, all hoping to join the family business that Morrison's aerospace contracts had made possible. Miguel worked 16 hours a day to meet Morrison's quality standards, building equipment that literally could not be obtained elsewhere at our price. Slide after slide, I introduced Harrison to people Gwen had dismissed as foreign connections. I showed him facility tours, quality certifications, testimonials from workers whose families depended on Morrison's business. I demonstrated how these weren't just supplier relationships, but partnerships with specific human beings who had staked their futures on Morrison's commitment. These suppliers weren't just providing components, I explained, watching Harrison's expression change as he absorbed the scope of what we had lost. They were providing components that cannot be replicated domestically. Akiko's textile process uses techniques her grandfather developed. The Petrova's packaging materials have chemical properties that American manufacturers can't match. The precision of Miguel's tools exists because he's been refining his processes for 20 years. Then I showed Harrison the financial impact. Not just the immediate delays in production, but the long-term consequences of losing supplier relationships that took decades to develop. The contracts we canceled represented partnerships worth $47 million annually with suppliers who had been averaging 18% growth year after year on their work with Morrison. Mr. Harrison, I continued, those partnerships weren't disposable overhead. They were competitive advantages that our domestic competitors don't have access to. We were paying lower prices for higher quality because those suppliers trusted Morrison enough to prioritize our contracts over potentially more lucrative opportunities. I watched Gwen's face throughout my presentation, seeing her confusion gradually turn to concern as Harrison asked increasingly direct questions about the termination decisions. Why hadn't she consulted with operations before canceling critical supplier relationships? Why hadn't she explored transition timelines instead of immediate terminations? Why hadn't she understood the coordinated withdrawal clauses before invoking them? But the moment that really changed everything came when I showed Harrison the final section of my presentation. The documentation I had collected on each supplier's previous experiences with American companies. The pattern of international partners being promised long-term relationships, delivering exceptional results, then being abandoned when companies decided to simplify their operations. These suppliers worked with Morrison even though they had been burned before, I explained, because they believed we were different. Because I spent 18 months proving that we valued their contributions and understood their value. Harrison was quiet for several minutes, studying the financial projections and supplier profiles. Finally, he looked at Gwen with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, but deep disappointment. Gwen, help me understand the strategic thinking behind eliminating $47 million in annual revenue without consulting operations, finance, or the executive team. And that's when I realized that Gwen finally began to understand that she had walked into a trap of her own making. Not because I had tricked her, but because her fundamental contempt for international partners had blinded her to the real terms of the relationships I had spent months negotiating. As she stammered through another attempt to explain domestic sourcing and simplified logistics, her confidence was wavering. She kept using phrases like these people and cultural complications, language that sounded increasingly problematic in the context of my presentation. What she didn't know was that there was much more to come. Because the real devastation wasn't just that we had lost 68% of our supply chain. It was that each of those suppliers had specifically mentioned never wanting to work with any company where Gwen Hollister had influence over international relationships. Harrison was silent for almost 5 minutes, reviewing every slide in my presentation. The air in the room was as tense as a violin string about to snap. What cultural complications? Harrison finally asked, his eyes fixed on Gwen. Gwen began to explain again about language barriers, time zone difficulties, the constant need for relationship management. But her confidence was wavering. She kept using phrases like these people and cultural complications, language that sounded increasingly problematic in the context of my presentation. Gwen, Harrison said slowly, did you review the withdrawal clauses in these contracts? Silence. Long, uncomfortable silence. Because according to Ashton's documentation, each international supplier had the contractual right to withdraw immediately if Morrison terminated other international suppliers without cause. Did you understand that canceling one contract would trigger coordinated withdrawal of all international partners? More silence. Gwen's face drained as she realized Harrison wasn't asking rhetorical questions. Mr. Harrison, she said carefully, I trusted that legal had reviewed these contracts properly. The withdrawal clauses seemed like standard protective language. Standard protective language, Harrison repeated slowly. Gwen, these clauses exist specifically to prevent companies from treating international suppliers as disposable. They are designed to ensure that partnerships are honored rather than eliminated on executive whim. I watched Gwen realize she had walked into a trap of her own making. Not because I had tricked her, but because her fundamental contempt for international partners had blinded her to the real terms of the relationships I had spent months negotiating. Ashton, Harrison said, turning to me, in your assessment, is there any possibility of rebuilding these partnerships? This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when I could deliver the truth that would change everything for Gwen without revealing my personal motivations. Mr. Harrison, I spent Friday reaching out to our former suppliers to explore possibilities for reconciliation. Unfortunately, the response was consistent across all partners. What response? They are willing to consider future relationships with Morrison, but only under one specific condition. What condition? They require written assurance that Gwen Hollister will have no involvement in relationships with international suppliers going forward. The room fell silent. Gwen stared at me as if I had slapped her. They what? She whispered. I'm sorry, Gwen, but I have to be completely honest about their feedback. Multiple suppliers specifically mentioned feeling disrespected during previous interactions with you. They cited comments about your English skills, dismissive attitudes toward their business practices, and what they perceived as cultural insensitivity. I pulled out my laptop again, showing Harrison-documented communications from our former partners. Not recordings or private conversations, but formal written responses to my reconciliation inquiries. Akiko Tanaka's letter was particularly devastating. Ms. Hollister's approach to international partnerships demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of mutual respect in business relationships. Her comments about foreign complications and simplified logistics suggest that Morrison views international suppliers as problematic rather than valuable. Miguel Santos was even more direct. We appreciate Ashton's professionalism, but we cannot risk future investments with company leadership that considers our contributions disposable. Ms. Hollister's termination approach indicates a systematic disregard for commitments to international partners. One by one, I shared feedback from suppliers on 3 continents, all expressing similar concerns about Gwen's attitudes and decision-making. These weren't angry attacks or emotional complaints, but professional assessments of why they couldn't trust Morrison's leadership going forward. These aren't personal attacks, I explained to Harrison. They're business decisions based on demonstrated patterns of behavior. International suppliers can't afford to invest in partnerships with companies that can arbitrarily eliminate them. Harrison spent the next hour reviewing supplier documentation, contract terms, and financial projections. He asked detailed questions about rebuilding possibilities, domestic sourcing alternatives, and operational timelines. Throughout the discussion, Gwen sat silently, growing increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of her miscalculation became clear. Finally, Harrison closed his laptop and looked directly at Gwen. I need time to review the situation with the board. Ashton, can you provide me with comprehensive documentation of our relationships with international suppliers and the specific feedback you received about rebuilding possibilities? Of course, Mr. Harrison. Gwen, I'm going to need you to prepare a detailed report explaining the strategic reasoning behind these termination decisions and your assessment of domestic sourcing alternatives. After the meeting ended, Gwen cornered me near the elevator, her professional composure finally cracking. Ashton, what exactly did you tell these suppliers about me? I looked at her with the same calm expression I had maintained throughout the presentation. I told them the truth, Gwen. I shared your exact words about no longer needing foreign connections. That's not. I didn't mean, she began, then stopped. You didn't mean what? That you don't value international partnerships? That cultural sensitivity is unnecessary? That relationship management is emotional complexity we can't afford. She stared at me, probably realizing for the first time that her casual dismissal of international suppliers had been documented and shared with the very people she had dismissed. Those suppliers trusted Morrison because they trusted me, I continued. When you terminated their contracts while calling their work foreign complications, you destroyed relationships that took 18 months to build. They're not angry, Gwen. They're protecting themselves from the exact kind of treatment you gave them. The elevator arrived, and I stepped inside. Before the doors closed, I said the words I had waited 15 years to deliver. Sometimes the people you consider disposable end up being the ones who keep everything running. If you've been following this journey of justice and strategy, subscribe to the channel because what happened over the next 3 weeks proved that underestimating the network of relationships someone has built can be the most expensive mistake a person can make. Because while Gwen was probably trying to find ways to blame others for the crisis she created, the wheels of consequence were already in motion. And each revolution would bring them closer to an outcome she never saw coming. 3 weeks later, Harrison announced a meeting with the entire executive board. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I received a direct invitation from him the night before. Ashton, I need you to present your findings on international suppliers to the entire board. Gwen arrived 15 minutes late, clearly nervous. Her nails were bitten, something I'd never noticed before. For 3 weeks, she had desperately tried to find domestic suppliers who could replace our international partners. Every quote came back with prices 2 or 3 times higher. Impossible timelines. Specifications that simply didn't exist in the US market. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, "you've all seen the numbers. Morrison lost $47 million in annual contracts in a single day. Our production has been at a standstill for 3 weeks. I need to understand how we got here." Gwen stood up with a set of slides prepared on strategic supply chain diversification. Same corporate language, same justifications about simplification and efficiency. When she finished, Harrison turned to me. "Ashton, do you have a different perspective?" I opened my laptop and projected a single image onto the screen: Miguel Santos factory in Mexico City, completely shut down. Machines covered, workers at home, equipment that took decades to develop now useless. "Gentlemen, this photo was taken yesterday. 16 families depended on Morrison's contracts to survive. Miguel Santos was training his 3 daughters to take over the family business. Now he's considering selling everything." Next slide: Akiko Tanaka in Osaka, dismantling the specialized equipment she had purchased specifically to fulfill our contracts. Akiko invested $300,000 in new machinery for our partnership. Equipment that is now useless to anyone else. Slide after slide, I showed the human consequences of Gwen's decisions. Not numbers on spreadsheets, but families destroyed, dreams shattered, lives turned upside down. "But here's what really matters," I continued, moving on to a new section. "I've received more feedback from suppliers about the possibility of reconciliation." Harrison leaned forward. "Positive feedback?" "Yes and no. All suppliers confirmed they would return to Morrison immediately under one specific condition." "What condition?" "A written guarantee that Gwen Hollister will never again have authority over international relationships. 0 involvement. 0 oversight. 0 influence." The silence in the room was deafening. 6 senior executives staring between me, Harrison, and Gwen, who was turning visibly pale. "They don't trust me specifically?" Gwen asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Gwen," I replied calmly, "they don't trust your fundamental approach to international partnerships. They have consistently cited her attitudes and language as indicators that Morrison views foreign suppliers as problematic rather than valuable." I pulled out the documented messages again. This time not just from our former suppliers, but from others in the industry who had heard about the situation through international communication networks. "Morrison's reputation in the global marketplace has changed in 3 weeks," I explained. "We've gone from trusted partners to a company that arbitrarily eliminates contracts. This doesn't just affect our existing relationships, it affects our ability to form new relationships with any international supplier." One of the directors asked the question that was in the air: "Ashton, in your professional assessment, what would it take to rebuild our position?" "A change in international procurement leadership. Contractual guarantees of stability. And most importantly, consistent demonstration over several months that Morrison genuinely values international partnerships." Harrison slowly closed his laptop. "Gwen, do you have anything to add?" Gwen tried one last defense about domestic sourcing and operational efficiency, but her voice was shaky, desperate. Every word sounded more like an excuse than a strategy. "I need to consult with the board," Harrison said finally. "Ashton, thank you for your transparency. Gwen, we'll talk privately." After the meeting, as I was gathering my materials, Gwen approached me one last time. "You planned this, didn't you?" she whispered. "From day one." I looked at her with the same calm expression I'd maintained for 18 months. "I planned to build relationships based on mutual respect and trust. You plan to destroy them because you consider people disposable." "That's not what." "Gwen," I interrupted gently, "you literally called our partners unnecessary foreign connections. Your own words were documented and shared with the people you discarded." I saw the moment when she finally understood. I didn't destroy her. It was her own actions, her own words, her own fundamental inability to see international suppliers as human beings worthy of respect. "Sometimes," I said as I closed my laptop, "the people you consider expendable end up being the ones who keep everything running. And sometimes, they remember how they were treated for much longer than you think." The following Friday, Harrison announced that Morrison was restructuring his procurement division. Gwen Hollister would be transferred to customer service, where her domestic focus would be better utilized. I was promoted to Director of Global Relations with full authority to rebuild the international partnerships Morrison had lost. And for the first time in 15 years, I felt that my father could finally rest in peace. The system that had destroyed him, built on contempt for people considered disposable, had finally met its own consequences. 6 months later, I was in my new office on the 45th floor welcoming Akiko Tanaka. She brought photos of her daughters graduating with engineering degrees, ready to expand the family business. "Ashton, you saved not only our business, but our dreams," she said, holding my hand. Harrison walked in with a smile. Morrison posted record profits this quarter. 49% increase. International suppliers accounted for 73% of that growth. The partnerships we almost lost became our biggest competitive advantage. Gwen lasted 8 months in customer service before transferring to a smaller company. Now she handles complaints for a distribution center, dealing daily with frustrated customers who feel ignored, just as she once made others feel. The irony was perfect. 3 years later, when Fortune wrote about Morrison as a model of ethical global partnership, the reporter asked what was the turning point. "When we realized that people are not disposable resources," I replied. If this story of transformation and justice has touched you, subscribe to the channel because there are millions of stories proving that patience and principles always win over arrogance. Sometimes, the people you consider disposable end up building the future you never imagined possible.